changes. So for example, the fall of the Roman Church and how it had less of a grip in Europe, you can see actual signs and indicators that this was happening. But for a historian, it's a little bit easier because they have a known factor or a known change, and then they work their way to find these signs that happened before. But what we're doing is that we're here right now. We have all these buzzing signals, but we're trying to sort of determine what are the unknown, uncertain possibilities, but sort of narrow them down a little bit. So basically, this is what we did.
That's great, Nadia. Thank you so much. I think it's really inspiring to hear the experience that you've had, and certainly, you know, COVID has been an accelerator of some signals, and it's mutated a variety of other signals. I wanted to jump to Abril, because Abril, in your work, not only with the Journal of Future Studies, but also at Centro, where you teach signal analysis, identification, signal mapping. You're working with students on this as an approach and process. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you know, your approach to signals and some of what you've seen happening recently.
Yes, well, as Nadia was saying, it's like the signals are very important to know how we can serve this tsunami of changes, as Jim Dater will say, and how it's going to be useful for creativity and how we can design the future based on weak signals and strong signals. And with my students, I've been working on how to identify these signals as a catalyst for creativity. And the main thing that it's important for ideas is the curiosity. And there is a say that says that that curiosity is some sort of insubordination, and in this time is the most important thing to do. So signals are the most important part of creativity, because it's where you can extract ideas in order to create better futures and to create participatory futures. And that way you can extract stories and you can extract visions. We also talk about big data and small data and how we can extract these stories from people in order to create better ways to see the world.
Great, thanks so much, Abril. I loved your point about the curiosity and insubordination. You know, sometimes the signals are quite challenging and they come across as provocations, and they really force us to reflect on what we're seeing and how we're seeing it. So let's jump over to Michael to hear his perspective. So Michael, you're in the US. Since the last time we connected, you've taken on a really interesting position. Could you talk a little bit about your work and what you're doing and how signal mapping fits into that?
Yeah, so I work as part of Ford. I'm with a group called D Ford, which is a in-house human-centered design and innovation agency in Ford. It has offices throughout the world, Detroit, where Ford's headquartered, of course, as well as in Shanghai and Palo Alto, London, Melbourne, and soon to be in Brazil. So that's my job, my day job. But then in addition to that, and I think probably, John, why I'm partly on this panel is because of the work that I did in Saudi Arabia previously. So that work has continues to kind of live on in as an installation, and is being shown around the world in different places, and most recently at a new museum that's opened up in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. But it was a work that was created over in 2017 to 2018 in collaboration with a Saudi designer, Ahad Al-Amoudi. Ahad and I met in London, and we began to collaborate really because we sensed that there was something happening. It was really clear that in Saudi and in the Gulf, there was a real buzz and energy happening, and we wanted to understand. So in terms of signals, like what were the signals? What was really going on? But we also were curious about the kind of tension between bottom up, kind of what's happening beneath the surface, but then how that was being kind of co-opted from the top down, and how the narrative around change and innovation and creativity was being used in a very top-down way in Saudi. And so that we created a work. It was an installation, a home actually, that we built in the desert as an installation in kind of a secret location. And then we filmed an interaction involving us in that home and created a whole story around why we were there and who we were. And we did it specifically in response to a very top-down project in Saudi, which is still going on, called NEOM, which is a futures city that is being built in the desert. So that's my story.
That's great. Thanks, Michael. I love that project so much, and that was one of the, I think, the things that initially had brought us together. And so it's interesting to hear the genesis of that and how signals really help to shape that. So I wanted to open it up to the panels to talk. You know, one of the challenges now, of course, is that we face a torrent of misinformation and disinformation. So trying to isolate, you know, the signals that are useful or the signals that, you know, we need to pay attention to can be a real challenge. So how are you finding it doing signal mapping now, especially when we seem to be facing this torrent of misinformation, disinformation, but also we're in a time of pretty radical uncertainty?
Yes,
Nadia,
I
do you
think
want?
that it.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, Nadia. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Abril. I can just, okay. So, so yes, one of the challenges is, I mean, misinformation in itself is a signal, John. What we're looking at right now, especially when it comes to trust and perceptions about trust of different sources of information and misinformation, that was actually one of the signals that we picked up at the national level. But I think in terms of methodology and the way you really have to go on about it when you do signal mapping is that you always have to use signal mapping and sort of always cross-check this using other different tools. So in our case, when, and I think within the signal mapping exercise, there were tools which were designed at every single point to actually go on and research and use other sources of data to also look at whether our signals were strong or weak. It's also very important to look at this over a longer amount of time. So it's also very important to see whether signals are always the same. So check in 3-4 weeks, is that signal still there or has it disappeared? But also cross-check it with other methods. So for example, in terms of misinformation, what we did is that we had a lot of signals of mistrust, misinformation, and we had sort of verified this through a national survey where we had asked people about certain things, and this is how we also verified. And this is one of the ways that you can use to verify whether signals are actual signals or just something else, you know, basically, and whether these are strong or weak signals as well. So over to you, Abril.
Thank you. I agree with Nadia. And also, well, we have these two, Rainer compares the culture with informatic systems like the hardware and the software. And it's also tracking signals. It's also about the gut, like the feeling. And checking peripherals, because what you already know, you have this experience. So tracking signals is like also not just like verify with numbers and statistics, but it's also about the gut. It's to feel if it's right or not, what is happening in your surroundings. And also it's very important the use of people, the stories that people could give you around that, because you have to extract those visions of the future, and will give you like a guidance to follow up a trace and to see if it's correct information or not. So I think that the gut is very important in signal tracking.
And I love this idea of trying to balance the stats, if you will, the data, and also the stories. You know, taking, of course, more of an ethnographic approach and really trying to connect with people. Michael, I imagine that's a large part of your work now when you're trying to take a human-centered approach to and use design-driven approaches to help solve, of course, some of the biggest challenges around mobility. So how is it that talking to people, connecting with people, using those approaches has been something that you've done, and what are some of the signals that have come out of that recently?
I mean, all of our work is really grounded in going out and talking to people. It's all grounded in human need. So when we're on a project, for instance, ethnographic research is central to what we do. At DFord, we have researchers, people whose specific job is to help us to conduct that research. So we hire ethnographers, we hire people who may have a PhD in anthropology, for instance, who really lead that work for us. They engage all of us, so we're all part of that process. We all go out and do research. However, they really lead the work and ensure that the work adheres to standards, not just Ford standards, but even industry standards and standards specific to anthropology and how you do ethnographic research in the field. So it's very much integrated into the work we do as part of kind of the process. And then in my creative practice outside of DFord, I would say that we always try and think of just what are some of the ways we might go out and talk to people, even when that's really difficult to do. So in Saudi, for instance, there were all kinds of limitations. Remember, this was 2017, 2018, so it was during the ongoing change in Saudi, but before certainly different than it is today. So there were restrictions around talking to people, and so we had to get pretty creative with that. So for instance, reaching out to people on social media and trying to drive conversations on social media using images that we created to prompt conversations, taking stories that were circulating in social media when Sophia, the robot, was introduced at an investment conference in Riyadh, and then using that as a prompt to be able to engage people around the future of technology and what did, and why was Sophia the image? What was Sophia in the context of Saudi? Who was she? So just being really creative and pushing the limits for how you get information and find people to talk to.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think that's really critical, trying to, give people the opportunity to share, but also creating those provocations as well, so people can kind of go beyond. And that's something I wanted to ask the panel about. So, what is it that you really are looking for in this? What is it that really catches your attention? It's, part head and part heart, right? It's also part of, that kind of gut feeling. So what is it that, and what happens when you really see and know a signal that is something that is really important or powerful?
Maybe I'll go. For me, that's a great question. And it literally is a gut feeling. I think when I found something that's most compelling or engages me the most, it's almost like this magic happens around it, where you've landed on something, and everything kind of just begins to fall in place. I think that for my current work, because it's very much industry driven, so it's around mobility, the future of mobility. But when even in terms of my own creative practice, it's this, I would almost say like this magical thing that just happens, where everything, you start with a story, and in the case of even the work that I just referenced before around Saudi, it started with a story. It started with us doing some initial research around a story from the 14th century involving an Persian Arab explorer, and then that just cascaded into it just kept going, and all these things were happening around us in Saudi Arabia, that in terms of kind of what was happening in the news, that began to relate to that story. And so it's almost this magic.
Yes, I agree with Michael. Also for me, it's to look for the weird, the magic, the impossible, like to go beyond our bias and what we think it's normal, like just to look for those hacks or those contradictions or those weirdness that are out there that are beyond our beliefs or our knowledge. I think that that's a good way that you're approaching to a very strong, well, a weak signal or something, or a vision of the future.
And where I also agree with Michael is that at the end of the day, the signals that you're also looking for are the signals that you want to be working on, or the ones that also have implications on your line of work. So because we did this within a country office context and within the context of a development organization and UNDP, we actually needed to focus also on signals where there would be important implications on specific programs and specific projects. So you can, well, you can actually tune up signal mapping and make it more thematic as well. So you can, for instance, look for specific signals in, let's say, if you're UNICEF, you want to be looking at signals in around education, for instance, but we're UNDP, so we were looking at political changes. We were looking at things around the environment because we have an environment cluster. So we also look for sometimes for specific themes, which are very much aligned with what we want to do and where we can actually strategically place ourselves. So that's also something that we want to focus on.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was glad to hear that there's a lot of continuity in this idea of, sort of finding your way to the signals and sometimes letting the signals finding you. And then Nadia also mentioned this idea of, scanning versus seeking, really trying to do these thematic kind of deep dives. And so that was going to be my next question is, when you think about the signals that are really speaking strongly to you, that have really come across on your radar, very recently, what are the examples of some of those top signals that you really think are speaking very strongly that you think could lead to this, further disruption and change? And certainly, again, we're living in a time of radical uncertainty. We're not asking anyone to make a prediction. That's not what this is about, but really would love to hear some examples of some of the signals that you think are speaking.
I can get started with one of the signals that that was very strong, and that we sort of something that did not come necessarily out of COVID-19, but during COVID-19, incidentally. And it was also something that we found quite unusual, interesting, and we started to see completely unusual, atypical sort of links between this signal and other patterns of change, which are completely unrelated. And I'm going to talk about blue jellyfish here. And so what happened during the summer, and we have the blue season in Tunisia, is that there were a lot of blue jellyfish that basically just invaded our shores. And of course, this is a pretty strong signals. There were hundreds and thousands of them. So everyone was tweeting about them, was talking about them on Facebook. There were other more health-related signals to that, which were the numbers of burns and stings from jellyfish, which started increasing. And so we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this, because the signals that were related to that actually were signals related to public policies and policies related to the environment, ecosystems, and preservation of biodiversity. So we started to see, even at the local level, a lot of municipalities issuing, for instance, fines for fishing specific species which were predators of jellyfish. So because blue jellyfish and their numbers increasing was also linked to how people actually manage waste around the shores. So this one signal that was very, very strong sort of started to link not only into one of our programs, but on a lot of aspects that we could work on. So, and after speaking to scientists, we actually realized that it was more or less the tip of the iceberg, and that basically it was signaling a much deeper change and things that have to do with global warming, with climate change. So I thought that was a very, very interesting and strong signal that we picked up during the exercise.
for me, it's here in Mexico City, what I've realized is the local assemblies are returning. This was something that happens around 1985 due to the Mexico City earthquake. And they are emerging again, like these local assemblies, instead, like as many people is losing their job for big enterprises. So they are starting to getting together by local assemblies, like small business and government and enterprises are not figuring in that structure. It's just the people, power to the people, and what we can do to help the other, and how we can construct an organization inside our communities. So it's been something that it's been happening for a while, but not right now. Actually, with COVID-19, has been very strong. Actually, in Twitter or all over social media, and actually, if you go on the streets, you see like, call this number if you are looking for a meal. Instead of calling McDonald's, please call to this small business that needs your help. Or people are starting like their DIY projects, and everything is going to local. Like everything is local right now.
I can't think of any that are that interesting. Everything is related to mobility and COVID, and I think that they're kind of obvious. And the question is, what will just revert back to some kind of normal after there's a vaccine? So I think it's hard to differentiate between the things that really signify possible long-term behavioral changes, and then what will just revert back to some kind of to normal in July, hopefully next year.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michael. You know, currently, of course, you know, in lots of different contexts, and we know it's different in different places, but you know, the impulse and the desire to get quote back to normal, of course, is quite strong, and clearly that's, you know, been an issue in lots of places. So there is this tension at the heart of, you know, looking for, like you said, you know, what do we see as really potentially leading towards, you know, dramatic behavioral and societal and cultural level changes versus, you know, potential kind of blips that, you know, of course can be disruptive, but, you know, we're really after the things that are, you know, driving forces that are potentially shaping the future. I want to turn to some of the questions that have come in the Q&A. So the first one is quite interesting because it brings us back to this question of practice and approach. And the question basically is asking, you know, okay, they understand the point around creativity and innovation, but how do you actually get to identify those actionable signals that can help an organization move towards strategic and sustainable change? What are the frameworks or mechanisms that you've used to really extract patterns from the signals to be able to have that analysis really provide some insights that's usable with all of the organizations that you're working with? Would love to hear your responses.
So when it comes to UNDP, and when we did this was actually one of the key questions, if you want, when we were doing the exercise. And I think that there are two very important points here. The first one being the complementary tools, again, that you use with signal mapping. So, and I think while we were doing the signal mapping, we started realizing that, oh, wait a minute. So we have great tools to sort of map signals, to look at signals, to sort of look at implications of signals and write these new normals narratives. But how do you translate that into an opportunity for a project or a program? So what we found ourselves doing is basically developing and designing on the go complementary tools to the signal mapping tools, which would basically translate whatever new normals we had and translate them into opportunities. And I think that, and this brings me to the second point, it's very important when designing these tools to have on board with you the people who are actually project implementers and program implementers. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who know their programs and their projects better. So we have the tools, we have the methodology, the approach, but they also can help us design or sort of bridge this gap between new normals, new narratives, and also what is around them and what they could create as an opportunity of change. So I think these are two we found that they were very important points during the signal mapping journey.
For me, it's a mix of methodologies because I'm seeing that they are asking for frameworks. And I think that there is no one great framework to use. It's just a mixture of everything, you know, from gut and from structures. For example, my favorite right now is Cipher from ABWeb to look at the fringe, like these contradictions, inflections, and it can help you to look from what's right now, what's happening in the near future, well, in the present, what could happen in the near future, and what will happen in the far future. So how we can take these lines, just like I imagine this game from connecting the dots, just like you start like seeing, like probably we are talking about politics, and then of environmental issues, but the things or the themes are starting like to getting together. And also the three horizons. I think that in order for us to ask what are the new paradigm, what could go wrong around all these signals that are happening, it's like just a mixture of things that we will need to continue. We have to ask. It's not just to have the right answer, but to ask the right questions around the signals, and that will help to connect the dots in order to have a better vision of the future.
I wish I could answer the question. Ford has a chief futurist, and the chief futurist officer is Cheryl Connolly, and she's part of D Ford, the organization I work with at Ford. She has a small team, and I know that they have spent a lot of time traveling the world and have come up with future scenarios that they then will work with product development teams at Ford to test those products against those future scenarios. But I can't speak to the specific methodologies that they've used beyond that.
Okay, and we have another question that I think relates to this, and the question is specifically around, you know, how do you get people to support your work when it is that kind of gut feeling? Of course, there's a process and a practice and there's research, but if you're coming up with the unusual thing, or you're spotting something that maybe others can't see, how do you bring them along on that journey? How do you get them to see that the signals are speaking?
Great question. That's a great question. I think that so I would say for Ford, one of the ways that they do it is through Cheryl Connolly and her futuring team. So she's incredibly knowledgeable. She does walk people very carefully through that process. And I think it's something people can relate easily to. I think that it helps that people understand, and this is whether it's Ford or elsewhere, we are in a moment of enormous uncertainty. And I think that people are more willing to kind of embrace these methodologies or this kind of more creative thinking given our current circumstances. And I think that it's a lot easier to kind of convince people to go along with this now and understand this. But I would say that, yeah, I mean, I don't know beyond that if there's really anything else I can really add. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that the most important thing to highlight here is that the future doesn't exist. So it becomes this white canvas, and it could be anything or anything at the same time. So how we can bring these signals to life, that's the important, for example, in creativity or in design, it's how you manage to bring that future vision alive. Like with a prototype, it's a story, an illustration, or an experience. It could be anything, like you name it. And I think that that's the way to, for people, if you don't see it, it's not there. It's just like COVID-19. If you cannot see the actual virus, and most people don't think that it exists. So how we can go and do something about that, about something that doesn't exist, then you can show it. You can make this prototype, these visions, to make it real and make it feel like you are part of this new future vision. So I think that that's a good way to prove that you are right of something that doesn't exist.
I think that was one of the most challenging parts of conducting signal mapping, actually, I think within UNDP or within any organization, but especially when you find yourself, because we actually did this within the context of developing what we call the CPD. So that's the country program document, which is basically the 5 years plan that UNDP makes and sort of the strategies and the outputs they're going to be focusing on in that country. And the CPD has very, very specific processes, just like any organization has very specific planning processes that they go through. And these planning processes are usually rely heavily on quantitative data, on data analysis, and things that are very much reliable for people. And so sort of bringing in signal mapping as an exercise and saying, well, you used to rely on these situation analyses made by a lot of experts in the field, but now let's have a look at all these signals around and things that are coming out from bakers, from taxi drivers, from local business owners. So that there was always, in the beginning, there was a bit of a shock, especially when it comes to the reliability of using these signals and how much will they really tell us about the future. And just like Abril said, the future does not exist. So we're sort of selling something that is a little bit of, a unicorn, so you're selling something, but it's not very concrete. And it's true that people need palpable things. But beyond everything, I think that just like Michael said, this is why COVID-19 was particularly helpful in this case. In the fact that it actually made people realize that, wait a minute, changes are happening so fast and there's so many things happening, and wait, we don't have time to actually go through very big analyses and data. This will take time, but we need to know right now what we can anticipate. And this is one of the things that we can hack to sort of get people on board.
Right. And I think that understanding the discomfort that this causes in people and that people might feel, I think is important, and being able to be empathetic and relate to that, be able to provide palpable examples when you can, be able to give some kind of concrete examples when possible helps, but just understand that, yeah, it can be a pretty uncomfortable place for people who are engineers, people who might be used to a very concrete world based on a very different kind of data and something that's very measurable.
Yeah, we've got some interesting questions that I think are moving us towards precisely this conversation. So this point around being empathetic, having an ethics or principles and approaching, this as a practice, I think is quite important. And so, some of the questions are, what if a community isn't there? What if a community is dealing with something, but they can't quite see the implications? How is it that you try to bring them along? And of course, we've talked about, giving examples, making it real. Do any of you have any examples where, you went on a bit of a journey with the community, or it took a little bit of time, or maybe it ended up in a whole nother place and direction? Would love to hear some examples from your professional work and your creative work.
Yes, for example, for me, I was doing a research around waste in Mexico City. And first I was like just asking my friends and close to the closed circle. And then I went to the core, to the main court. And actually it was very difficult to get into the people, to let you into the community. So you have to build this rapport and to try not just to have this colonization idea that I'm coming here to teach you how things are done. Like, no, it's all the way around. What can you teach me? And what do you know? And what can I learn from you? And those kind of approaches are very helpful. Robert Texter have this interview on how to make questions in order for people to bring those visions from the future and to let you into their world, because it's just to get into their world, not your world to them. And I think that that's very important to have in mind, just to what the other people can teach you about certain subject. In the case of waste, like for example, it was a way of living. It was their houses were built around waste. So what is the importance for them? What are the visions that they have around this? Because we born with this gift or this skill to think about the future, but we have to train. We have to have this knowledge, and if you don't have it, then how you can help to encourage this by building rapport with the community that you are dealing with.
I absolutely agree with the entire posture, and Abril, you're right. I think that having a humble posture and having this posture of saying we are seeking these. So at the end of the day, yes, we have the tools, the methodology, but the tools and methodology is only as good as the people around it and using it, and the people who you actually are with you in the exercise. So actually, one of the key points in trying to get as many diversified signals is actually to get on board a diverse number of people and having sensor networks that basically bring you a lot of information from different aspects. So absolutely agreed.
I just would second and third that. I think that it's about, even if you have the tools, the methodology, if you're well trained, if you don't have a certain personality type, or you just don't have empathy and it's not something that comes second to you or is maybe natural to you, I think it can really hinder you. And I've had lots of conversations around, well, how do you teach empathy? How is empathy something that you can learn? I'm beginning more and more, I think it's just something people have, and some people don't have empathy. And I think that it does hinder them from being able to do the work well. I've been on lots of research projects where someone is really skilled and they're really trained, but the way they just show up in a community creates difficulty.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. You know, the how we presence ourselves to the work and of course to the communities that we engage with, of course, you know, creates the whole space for things to, you know, be effective and useful for those communities, but also to potentially go in another direction and to be a detriment to those communities. So there's an interesting question here around, are there signals that, you know, you've seen that have turned out to be duds that you were really interested and excited about and you thought really had a lot of potential, but, you know, kind of flamed out a little bit or didn't seem to go anywhere, or, you know, you spent time tracking it and maybe thought, well, all right, we're going to let this go. Anything that, that fits that category?
I'm gonna go. Sorry, Michael, were you gonna answer?
No, go ahead, Nadia.
I'm gonna go with online education. I think that was one of the very first very strong signals that we had at both at the regional and national level, and we thought that basically COVID-19 was going to foster this, you know, online international education system that was going to be just completely virtual, and we're going to be using Zoom for all the classes, and so this was one of the very, very strong signals, and there was really a lot of buzzing around that, and not just at the national but really at the international level. And so we started pursuing this and seeing how governments also responded to this need and to this sort of pressure to go online, to put everything online, while a lot of them were not equipped to do so. And actually what it has shifted towards, so this was during the first wave, but in Tunisia, what it has shifted towards is, and actually there was a lot of surveys that were basically done with parents at the beginning of the school year who were basically registering their children. And it turned out that basically about 70% of Tunisians were not equipped and could not actually handle any online learning. So this was only going to increase the gap in equity when it comes to education. So instead of looking at that, what has emerged now as a stronger signal, still within education, is more around parental involvement. So this has shifted. So from looking at online learning, we're looking more at how parents are more involved and how we're shifting perhaps, or there's a pressure to shift more towards an autonomous sort of education where the student is more autonomous and can learn more, because there's this pressure now on parents to sort of teach their children with all the interruptions and so on. So this is more like a signal that did not die, but transformed into something else. And there's a lot of signals like that, but that was one of the examples.
I can't think of any specific examples, but for me, they're signals. I would say when your bias gets in the way, when it's not really a signal, that's more either it is a signal and you don't see it because you have your own bias, or when you drive something forward that you think is a signal, but it's really just coming out of your own either self-interest or your own bias in some way or other. You're misreading something through bias.
As for me, for example, it's around futurist thinking. Like we have this present shock, but also we have this future shock at once. Like everything is immediate. Like right now we are all around the world and we can be together in the same place. And how entire governments are been thinking about if we were having the enough tools to figure out what COVID-19 will do to us, and we might do something around this. So I've been seeing a lot of things that, for example, I used to work in advertisement, and they were like, brands always tell you like, no, the strategy is for 1 year, 2 year, because everything changes so fast. So it has to be a 1 year plan, a 2 year plan in communication. It's not, it cannot be longer. But then they start like, whoa, then if we think from 10 to 20 years from now, what can happen? What can we do in the present to go to that future? And I think that for me, I'm starting like, what would happen? Like, for example, besides teaching history in schools, they also teach you future studies in school. So how can be more resilience around change, to have this plasticity around change, to be more, and it makes you not just to live in the present, but also to learn from the past, to have a better present, and how can you build a better future around this knowledge that you're given. So I think that that's for me one of the signals that I've been tracking around this time.
Great. We've only got about 9 or 10 minutes left. I wanted to turn the conversation a little bit to who I believe is probably a good bit of our audience, which is the Youth Futures Fellows. So the fellows are undergoing a multi-week futures thinking process where we're going to do signals mapping actually just later this week. We're going to do scenarios. We're going to be doing some participatory futures. What are the messages and what are the things that you think it's important for them to know and understand about doing this work as they begin that journey? And of course, this applies to any youth who are interested in taking on this kind of work and potentially looking at this as a career.
I guess one message I would say is don't be scared of the really scary things. Don't shy away from the really difficult topics. I think that this work can be co-opted easily, just like anything. So push the edges, be aware of the things no one wants to talk about, and dig there and go deeper there. Don't censor yourself.
I think one of the messages, especially if they're going to be doing signal mapping soon, would be definitely not to be intimidated by the big names like signal mappings or signals, because these can sort of make you think that you're looking at something that is very invisible and sophisticated. The tools are actually pretty simple. very straightforward, but they're still very powerful. But the process itself is actually something that I think above everything you should enjoy, and you should sort of just pursue, and just like Michael said, explore, explore, explore. And I'm not just saying this because I'm head of exploration, but really pursue any sort of interesting topics or things that are of interest of you, because I think that the more the starting point is these signals, but the more passionate you would be about a specific topic, the more you're going to dig into these signals and what they mean. I think there's a lot of work to be done beyond the signal mapping. So definitely don't be intimidated by the big words, by the tools. Pretty simple, straightforward, and just have fun doing it.
Yes, for me, it resumes in curiosity. Just be this insubordination around curiosity. Ask everything you can, observe, smell, touch, everything you can. And as Michael says, don't be afraid of the impossible or the magic or the things that might sound scary, but you might be found in something interesting around that.
Great. Okay, so I'm gonna bring this last question in, and it sort of combines two questions. So we have one question that says, are there signals that indicate positive changes? Of course, we talk a lot about the disruptive signals, and of course those are the ones that often get a lot of attention. And then there's a question about how do you feel about the future? Are you worried about the future? Are you optimistic? So if you could just weave in some responses to those two questions around this, are there signals that you think are indicating and pointing towards positive change? And then, yeah, what's your general sense of the future? How are you feeling? Of course, knowing it's a time of radical uncertainty about where things look to be heading.
Oof. I think that it's so easy to focus on, I think it's pretty obvious, everyone would agree that it's much easier to focus on the negative, and the positive changes are sometimes are harder to spot. And I think that we often don't gravitate there naturally. And so I would say that in terms of the future and how I feel about the future, I think that whose future, I'm not sure whose future, there's so many different futures. Whether it's my future here in North America, as a white man of my age in North America, or the future of my friend in Saudi Arabia who's experiencing freedoms that were unthinkable 10 or 15 years ago. It's really easy for me to criticize a lot of those freedoms because of the political context of Saudi Arabia and all the other horrible things that are happening. But those freedoms are really meaningful to her and to other people in Saudi Arabia. And so I think the future's complex. The future is a lot of different futures depending on who you are. And I guess that's a cop-out. But how am I feeling about the future? I don't know. I really don't know. I think I have no idea.
That's a fair answer, I think, actually.
I agree with Michael. I don't know how to feel about the future because there are some positive signals, but then as we were talking a couple of weeks ago, John, like what we are going to teach to our children, like how to send an email and how we are going to like these visions that are like, wow, what we are going to give to the future, to the younger generations in the future. So it's been a roller coaster for me to think about the future, but I don't know. I simply don't know. It's like half and half, I think.
I'm going to try to be a little bit more biased and positive about this. But if we look at, again, if we look specifically at what is happening right now, the health crisis, and I was talking in the beginning about how usually crises and disasters can actually reveal vulnerabilities in the system. So I'm going to try to be positive here and say that throughout all these signals and whatever COVID is going to bring to the world is going to be precipitating, not necessarily positive changes, but definitely some of these would be looking at vulnerabilities and sort of saying, okay, so we're having these issues. COVID-19 is showing us this, so let's try to work on them. And I'm trying to be as positive as a UNDP or development agency person can be. So.
And
great. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
no, I was just gonna say on that, I think I really agree with Nadia, and that's funny because I just had a conversation this morning, and without steering into politics, but as horrible as some recent events have been in the US, all of that was there. So isn't it better that it came to the surface? And I think that that's the same with COVID. I mean, it was all there. It was all just, and things just needed to be brought to the surface, so at least they can be talked about and we can see them.
Yeah, that's certainly been a theme for this year, right? You know, veils are dropping left and right, and you know, it's a hard time. It's an uncertain time, and I hope everyone is staying safe and staying well. But it's also a time of coming to grips with a lot of structural and historical inequities that are long overdue. So I want to thank each of you for your heartfelt engagement, for all of your insights. I'm going to toss it over to Jen. Jen, we've had a really interesting conversation. What do you think?
Great, thank you for that, and thanks to the panelists. The future doesn't exist. Abril, thank you for that statement. I think that really is really powerful statement, and especially as we go through this fellowship with young people across the region. You know, we ask them to submit make a creative application to the fellowship, and you all talked about making it visual and making it to be able to feel something about the future or about a signal. And these applications, we had poems, we had stories, we had songs, we had videos. We had paintings. It was very kind of a very strong emotional representation of kind of hope about the future. So I'm going to align with my colleague Nadia about thinking that we have some kind of positive outlook on the future. And what we're trying to do with this is strengthen this this futures literacy, so that there can be kind of more, I don't know, robust thinking about the future and about engagement in creating that future, contributing to that future in your communities. And so we're really excited about the fellowship, and we're excited that to hear your different perspectives. I mean, we have very different sectors. You're representing very different sectors. So it's really interesting to hear kind of across these sectors, the importance and the role that futures literacy can play in your work, and kind of how it manifests itself in your work. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for sharing your perspectives with us, and particularly with the youth fellows. Appreciate that. Just to say, this is the first of our 4-part series on futures. Next week we will be talking sci-fi, science fiction. And then we'll get into scenarios, we'll get into stories. I think in the chat box you can find the registration for next week's session. So hope you can come back and join us next week. Thanks again, Michael, Abril, Nadia, and John, to you as well. See you all next time.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you, bye. Thanks
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.